Good morning, everybody. My name is Michael Rivera, and today I'm going to be informing you about the difference between architects and engineers, but specifically in the building design process. So, when most people look at a building, they usually just see kind of like the final result, which are like the walls, the windows, the doors, the spaces inside. But, before a building is actually, built, architects and engineers, work together behind the scenes. And so a lot of people confuse them because, both work on buildings and both use drawings, but, they focus on different things. Um, Architects usually focus more on like the design layout, how people are going to use that space, and how, building looks and feels. Engineers, on the other hand, they focus more kind of like on the structure, systems, calculations, and just making sure that the building works safely. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor, the architects plan, design houses, factories, office buildings, and other structures. And to me, this means like that, architects aren't just drawing random ideas. They like they are like helping turn an idea or a client's needs into a real building. And for example, if someone wants to build a school or an office or a house or maybe even a community center, the architect has to like think about what rooms are going to be needed, how big they should be, whether people are going to be entering, through the sides or how they're going to be entering, how people are going to move through the building. And so, kind of like to help with my visual aid is this. So, this is a floor plan which shows kind of like the architect's role, um, because it shows kind of like the doors, the walls, the rooms, dimensions, kind of like the circulation also. And even though it just looks like simple lines, it kind of explains how the building is going to be organized, how people are supposed to use the space. And so architects also create other forms of info, which are called like sections, elevations, schedules, and details to explain the building better. Another cited source that I had was from the American Institute of Architects, and according to them, the during the construction, document phase, architects, create more detailed drawings that include information about materials and construction details. So, the architect's job is creative, but it's also technical because they have to explain, the design clearly so that people, can understand it and build from it. Um, Next is kind of like the engineers. They also have a role similar to the architects, but they have a different role, which is, they focus more on like the technical parts of the building. There are different types of engineers, which are specifically five of them, which I've worked with before, which are kind of like the structural, the mechanical, the electrical, plumbing, and the civil engineer. A structural, he works more with beams, columns, foundations, framing, and calculating loads. A mechanical engineer works more with heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, and another two, which are the electrical engineers. They work with power and lighting fixtures, switches, stuff like that. And also the plumbing engineer, which works with water lines and drains. Another cited thing that I had was from the U.S. Bureau of Labor. Specifically, they said that civil engineers plan, you know, design and supervise construction, and maintenance of a building infrastructure. So this kind of like shows that engineers are connected to the practical side of construction, and they help make sure that the project can actually function. Um, I have here another visual aid, which is this. So this is from a structural engineer. They kind of like help visualize what elements are needed to create that detail, stuff like that. As you can see, it's also stamped by a licensed structural engineer. There's also something known as a structural framing plan, and it's similar to like a floor plan, but it shows more, like how the beams are going to be aligned, how how the columns, the floor, all these little details that are going to be needed in the structural side of things, and just kind of like how to show kind of like how the system works. And similar to like an architect, it might you know might design an architect might design a big open lobby, but the structural engineer has to like figure out how that open space can be supported safely, because something's gonna have to be able to support that big open space. Either that could mean using bigger beams, stronger columns, or just some kind of different structural system. And so architects and engineers, they have to like coordinate with each other. They can't really work separately, because a building needs to both be design and technical. So for example, an architect may design a ceiling height, and but the mechanical engineer, he might need space above the ceiling for like air ducts. Another example would be kind of like when an architect places a window in a wall, but the structural engineer has to like make sure that the wall still works and functions, and stuff like that. So like this is why coordination is really important, because in conclusion, architects and engineers, they both help create buildings, but architects focus more on the like kind of like the design space and planning and how people use the building, while engineers, they focus more kind of like on the structure, systems, safety, and technical performance. And when we both work together, a building can move from an idea on paper and become a real thing, that people can use every day. So yeah, thank you.